Tell me if this sounds familiar. There's a triangular region on a body of water, and it's infamous for the numerous mysterious disappearances of ships and planes that occur there. And if you thought of the Bermuda Triangle, I don't blame you. But as it turns out, there's another place that fits this description, one that actually has a higher concentration of these incidents. And it exists right here on the eastern region of Lake Ontario. Welcome to the Great Lakes' very own mystery zone, the Marysburgh Vortex.
This thing in the sky, and it was like a diamond shape, and we stared at this thing and it just sat there hovering.
But there was not a single trace of the crew, and nobody ever did figure out what happened to them.
Recently, while researching another story, I came across this book, Gateway to Oblivion. In it, the author, Hugh Cochrane, recounts several stories of disappearances and disasters that leave more questions than answers. Honestly, when I first read these stories, I figured they weren't true or had to have been wildly exaggerated. But imagine my surprise when I started looking them up and they in fact did happen. And I'm talking ghost ships, vanishing planes, boats, bizarre stone monoliths, and naturally, even some UFO encounters. Now, the author goes further and includes some pretty interesting theories to explain some of these recorded mysteries. And they range from the relatively scientific to some of the most wild and out there theories I've ever heard. So for today's video, I wanted to explore the strange events that have occurred in the Great Lakes Bermuda Triangle and the explanations presented in this book. And we'll also take a look at some more modern and mainstream interpretations of the events along the way. So first, what is the Marysburgh Vortex? And this region takes up the eastern part of Lake Ontario, with the boundary markers being Oswego, New York, Kingston, and Prince Edward County, which used to be called Marysburgh Township, and so that's where the name comes from. This area is known to be home to strange and powerful weather anomalies. Storms that basically appear out of nowhere, intense wind currents, and even wintertime snow squalls were all very common. And we'll get more into these phenomena later on, but for now, suffice it to say that the weather on the lake is fairly unpredictable. But more than just that, it seems to be home to incidents that simply defy all reasonable explanations. It's been reported that, taking up less than a quarter of the Lake Ontario area, the Marysburgh Vortex is recorded to have up to 500 shipwrecks and 40 plane incidents, which, as Global News has put it, is a far higher concentration than can be found in the famous Bermuda Triangle. While most people point to the bad weather as being the primary cause of these wrecks, there are some stories which can't seemingly be explained by something like weather. Let's take a look at one of those stories right now. A few days ago, a cargo ship named the Bavaria started its journey hauling timber across Lake Ontario. 2 days ago, it would have entered the Marysburgh Vortex. And for those last 2 days, there had been a freak storm, and the Bavaria never made it to port. Today, several ships are sailing out of Kingston in search of the vessel. It's an act of bravery, as they know they'll have to search within the vortex. After some time, one of the rescue ships, the Armenia, would spot the Bavaria on a small island known as Galoo Island. To their surprise and relief, even from afar, they could see that the ship appeared to be in great condition. It was upright and nothing appeared to be broken. In fact, it kind of just looked like it was just anchored there. And so they quickly adjusted course and sailed directly to it. And once they got within earshot of the lost ship, they began calling out to it and blowing their whistles, but they were met with complete silence. They anxiously pulled closer, and they could begin to hear what sounded like a faint whistling coming from the ship. The captain and some trusted crew would row over and board the ship to investigate. What they found that day would become one of the lake's strangest and longest unsolved mysteries. Nothing. They found nothing. Well, more accurately, no one. The entire crew of the Bavaria was nowhere to be found. The single lifeboat was missing, but there were no signs as to where the crew might have gone. The faint whistling they had heard earlier turned out to be the ship's canary still in its cage, whistling its little song. Had they abandoned the ship? Well, there was seemingly no reason to. The ship was a little waterlogged, something you'd expect of a vessel that had been sitting there for some time. But other than that, there were no signs of damage anywhere. The captain's hold still had the money they'd made from their cargo dealings, and even the captain's papers were still there. The ship's oven had a loaf of bread that had been baked earlier, though the fire was out. And even more strange, someone appeared to have been in the middle of a repair job on the deck, to which they just stopped for some reason. Given that the lifeboat had been taken, many assumed that the surviving crew would turn up somewhere, but no one was ever found. The Bavaria itself was actually in such good condition, the crew of the Armenia were able to sail it back to Kingston. And then it continued on its shipping career for at least 10 years. As Hugh, Cochrane, and others have noted, considering the evidence, it would seem that the Bavaria had weathered the storm and that things had turned out normal and regular duties were being attended to. Then something out of the ordinary occurred on board the ship. Whatever it was, that something was so threatening and vehement that all of those aboard attempted to flee the vessel, possibly in the single lifeboat. But none escaped whatever horror it was that had invaded their ship. In the end, it claimed them all. But that's not where the story ends. It's been recorded that a few days after the Bavaria went missing, other people in the area individually reported spotting a lifeboat with men aboard. In his book, he mentions that another ship sighted a lifeboat on the lake with two motionless figures at the oars, and that the ship tried to maneuver back to pick up the two men, but every time they tried, the lifeboat would just keep veering away. And the author continues to mention that the entire time, the two men on the boat were just motionless, as if in a daze. So eventually they simply just disappeared into the thick fog. He continues on to mention the report of a lighthouse keeper who also spotted two men in a lifeboat, and he also tried to save them. But again, they made no attempt to be saved, and no matter how close he got, the boat just drifted away. So these reports differ from other ones that I've seen in a couple of ways, though they seem to be referring to the same story. What the reports from both sources agree on, though, is that around the time the Bavaria went missing, a lifeboat had been spotted in the area with people in it, but for various reasons, they were not able to be rescued. And that's probably all we'll ever know regarding what happened to the crew of the Bavaria. May they rest in peace. Speculation abounds as to what could have caused a seasoned crew to abandon their perfectly functional ship like this, but the mystery will likely endure forever. In the story of the Bavaria, at least the ship was able to be found in order to attempt to piece together the events of that fateful day. But in other cases, sometimes both ship and crew would disappear, and in the case of the Picton, it vanished in plain sight. The Picton is sailing straight through the Marysburgh Vortex, accompanied by two escort ships, the Acacia and the Minas. The distance at which they're following the Picton was close enough that if the Picton had encountered any trouble, even crashing into a rock and beginning to sink, they would be able to reach and assist the ship in no time. And yet, as they were looking at the Picton, it was as if they blinked and it was gone. Some eyewitness records actually mention that it appeared to them as if the ship fell into a bottomless pit. They quite literally saw the sails go down, and in an instant, the entire ship was gone. The escort ships combed the area where they literally just saw the Picton, and the author notes that they couldn't find any trace of the ship or its crew. Other reports indicate the only things left were a few loose gratings and a sailor's cap. To make matters even more bizarre, a few days later, at Sackett's Harbor, northeast of where the Picton vanished, a boy would find a bottle that floated into the harbor. Noticing there was something inside it, he fished it out and opened it. And what he found inside would not only shock the locals, but it would add a layer of complexity to this mystery that almost seems to defy logic. The bottle contained a message written by Jack Sidley, captain of the Picton. But it's not just who it was from, but what the message contained that confounds investigators to this day. The message read, "I've tied Vesey to me with a heaving line so that we can both be found." Vesey was Captain Jack's son. And while this seems like a fairly straightforward, though incredibly macabre message, it raises more questions than it answers. I mean, the escort ship saw the Picton disappear almost instantly, just before it was sailing perfectly well. So when did the captain write this message? Common sense would say that it must have been before the ship vanished. But if that's the case, what kind of emergency would the captain have been facing that in only a few moments, he knew his only recourse was to leave a message in a bottle and then secure it with cork and wire and then get a rope to tie him and his son together? No signaling of the escorts or any kind of distress message. As Hugh Cochrane alludes, it doesn't really make sense that the message would have been written before it vanished. So it must have been after. But then that raises an even bigger question. I mean, the escort ship saw the Picton vanish in the blink of an eye. How could he have written it then? I mean, Where was he? Perhaps while the ship was submerged, there was still some pockets of air where the captain had a chance to write this. However, Hugh Cochrane explores this possibility, and he doesn't seem to find it likely for a few reasons. The cargo of the coal the Picton was carrying would have been sufficient to take the ship to the bottom, if the hold had somehow filled with water. At this location, the lake sloped sharply from 200 feet to a depth of 500 feet, enough to cause the trapped air to burst the hull and send debris to the surface, along with a foaming fountain of air and water. But searchers who had remained in the area for several hours stated they had found nothing. Who's to say what actually occurred? Mr. Cochrane does provide a possible general explanation for this and the other incidents, but it's best we discuss it later as they all sort of tie together. With just these two examples, you've already seen how the Marysburgh Vortex is really no joke. It's home to the strange and seemingly inexplicable. But people are rational, and we have an innate pull to try and explain everything. However, when there's a lack of evidence or any real satisfactory explanation by ordinary means, it leaves the door open to speculation, to the extraordinary, even the supernatural. And that's something that seems to be exemplified with the incident of the HMS Speedy. Before getting into the story, Cochrane first notes that many retellings of the event of the Speedy often neglect to include a crucial, quite literally large detail that adds another layer of mystery to an already enigmatic event. These other retellings all fail to mention the role played by that of a giant stone monolith protruding from the lake bed like a prehistoric skyscraper. Okay, let me explain. Charting all of the waters of Lake Ontario was still a relative work in progress. In a few months prior to the events of the Speedy, a man named Charles Selleck, captain of the Lady Murray, would discover a strange rock formation underneath the waves in Lake Ontario. Since the rock was only 3 feet below the surface of the water, he considered it a possible hazard, and so Selleck had his crew measure it. And his findings were so shocking that he had to measure it twice. But it came out the same as the first time. He measured this rock to be 40 feet across and 300 feet deep. A giant monolith, just sitting there out on the lake, seemingly having gone unnoticed before. As mentioned, Captain Selleck was in charge of the Lady Murray, one of the only schooners on this side of the lake, the other being the Speedy. Realizing the scale of the hazard, Selleck personally showed Thomas Paxton, the captain of the Speedy, the rock formation so that he would be aware. It's said that they both agreed to file reports to have the charts of the lake updated to show where this newfound hazard was. Alright, I think that's enough preamble, so now let's dive into the incident of the HMS Speedy. This story begins with murder. An Ojibwa man named Ogitonakut has been accused of killing a white man. Reportedly, it was an act of revenge for the murder of his brother. For various reasons, his trial couldn't be held where he had been captured, and so instead it was decided that the trial would take place in a newly built courthouse in Newcastle at Presqu'île Bay. And so arrangements would be made to transport everyone needed for the trial, from York, which is modern-day Toronto, to Newcastle. The powers that be at the time decided that they would be transported by boat, and a government gunship, the HMS Speedy, was chosen as the worthy vessel. Almost immediately after departure, the Speedy would encounter problems when it ran aground, meaning it managed to get stuck in shallow water. It would take 2 hours for the crew to free the ship from this foreboding omen, and this timing would prove to be rather crucial for the fate of the Speedy. After freeing the ship, they continued along their route and would actually be met with pleasant weather and assisting winds. Locals at Presqu'île Point, awaiting the arrival of the Speedy, were delighted when they spotted the ship just 1.5 miles out of the harbor. But no sooner than the Speedy is seen, a violent storm came in from the northeast, and almost as if the ship had been gripped by an invisible hand, it would be pulled back into the open lake and out of sight. A large bonfire would be lit on Presqu'île Bay to guide the ship back to port, but the Speedy would never be seen again. According to some records, when the news of the disappearance of the Speedy spread, Captain Selleck of the Lady Murray led an expedition out on the lake to try and find answers, and he already had an idea in mind of where to look. You see, the direction to which the Speedy was seen being pulled toward was the very same direction as the giant stone monolith Selleck had found and shown Speedy's captain, Thomas Paxton. And Selleck knew that if the ship had collided with that rock formation, well, the answers to the ship's whereabouts would be easy to find. Finally arriving near the site of the monolith, they would begin dragging the bottom of the lake to find wreckage. Not only did they not find any trace of the Speedy, they realized that the entire monolith had disappeared. I mean, it was just gone. There was no depression left in the lake bed or anything. It was now flat and sandy, as if it had never been there in the first place. Hugh Cochrane bookends his retelling of this discovery with the following passages. By the law of averages, there should have been a very large pile of stones on the bottom if the Speedy had collided with the monolith and toppled it. There was no such pile. If the ship had hit the monolith, then it should have sunk on or near the site, and the debris and wreckage should have turned up on the nearby shore. But there was no such wreckage that could be linked to this ship. If neither the monolith nor the ship was in the area, then the natural question is, what kind of force could transport the entire multi-ton stone slab and the vessel to regions unknown? Such a force is beyond what we normally think of as being natural. It is supernatural. It's from here that Hugh Cochrane begins putting forward and exploring said realm of the supernatural as a means to explain the unexplainable. It seems as if the monolith acted like a magnet. When it had gathered all the elements together, it eliminated them. Then it was no longer needed, and it too was eliminated. It will never be known for sure whether the Speedy was still under the control of Captain Paxton as she was swept to the site of the monolith, or whether she was under the control of some unknown outside force. If it was the latter, then she isn't the only ship to find herself possessed by masters not of this world. For some, there was the attraction that drew them onto rocky shores. Others simply sailed into a fog and vanished. Still, others were reduced to kindling. Later on in his book, Cochrane mentions that this isn't the first time that large geographical features have vanished in this area. As an example, he mentions a map drawn by Samuel de Champlain during early expeditions, which showed Lake Ontario to contain several large islands, which other explorers only a few decades later traveling through the area wouldn't see present. In his book, Cochrane explores the supernatural possibilities to explain these events, as evidenced by the idea of this monolith sort of pulling the Speedy to its doom. And I'm not really here to say that the supernatural doesn't exist or it's incorrect to look at it this way. But what I will say though is that while reading up on this story, I came across various sources, some old and some new, retelling the events of that day. And I was pleasantly surprised to come across this work. And after reading it, it kind of puts into question some of the details that are often passed around as facts of the legend of the Speedy. Frankly, it sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole, so bear with me here, I promise it'll be worth it. I'm not really sure where to begin with this comparison, but right away it actually challenges the idea that this monolith ever even existed. The entire account of Captain Selleck showing Captain Paxton this monolith and later discovering its disappearance comes from the memoirs of Selleck's grandson, which is dated to about a century after it would have taken place. And prior to this, no official logbooks, charts, or naval records from 1804 document the rock or its discovery, which is interesting considering in the story of the captains finding the rock, they were said to have agreed on reporting it for updating the charts. For this and other reasons, many historians today don't really think this rock formation existed. Additionally, while the Speedy's wreckage wasn't found, there seemed to have indeed been debris found. It's reported that Speedy's topmast, binnacle seat, and red-painted hen coop were found just east of Oak Orchard River, on the south shore of Lake Ontario. The finding was initially reported by the sheriff of the home district, whose brother was lost on the Speedy, and then it was later corroborated by a report from the commanding officer of Niagara. And to keep it brief, from there it was determined that it was most likely the Devil's Nose Reef where the Speedy had struck and then foundered. There is one key aspect to the story of the Speedy that for some reason is missing in Hugh Cochrane's retelling though. And that's that it was widely recorded that the Speedy was poorly constructed. At the time of the ship's construction, there was a lot of political tension, having just come after the American Revolutionary War. And for good reason, as evidenced by the fact that the War of 1812 was soon to come. Because of this, the gunship Speedy was hastily constructed, and unfortunately it was made with unseasoned wood, and not even the best kind of wood. As such, it was known to need constant maintenance. It was rotting, constantly leaking water in, and basically just unfit for service. In heavy storms, there would need to be crew members constantly pumping water out in order to keep the ship afloat. So I think you can start to see the picture being painted here. The ship was kind of running on borrowed time. And remember that the ship immediately ran aground after departure, likely due to having taken on too much water already. This delays them by 2 hours. If they hadn't been delayed, they would have avoided the heavy storm they eventually encountered. And as previously outlined, the ship just wasn't in a condition to handle these kinds kinds of storms. The Speedy's captain, Thomas Paxton, an extremely capable Marine, was naturally aware of the condition of the ship. I mean, he's the one who's been dealing with it for some time. So then why would he set sail that day? Knowing the importance of the trip, the high status of the people on board, I mean, why risk it? Well, that's actually kind of interesting. It's been recorded that sometime earlier that year, Paxton had refused to take the Speedy out to sea for some task. He cited that the ship was too poor in condition to be safe. His superiors, however, would essentially force him to do it. So he did, and the mast of the ship broke during his mission. So did his superiors then take his input more seriously? No. I mean, when do superiors ever do that? Instead, they tried to save face and just accused Paxton of doing it on purpose because he didn't want to take the ship out. And so on that fateful day, Paxton knew it would be risky, but he also knew his superiors had it out for him and likely felt that if he had refused this incredibly important task, it would mean a court-martial for him. Not to mention, Paxton had a wife and 7 kids he was supporting on an already low salary. Of course, there's always an argument for risking getting fired by refusing anyway, but taking the risk to sail is kind of also understandable. I mean, he had sailed it successfully many times before. So after taking a look at this source, it seems like we actually know what would have caused the Speedy to sink. All that being said though, where is the actual shipwreck? One would have expected that it shouldn't be too difficult to find. Many old wrecks have been found in the lake over the years. So how come the Speedy has never been found? Actually, it might have been. In 1991, a wreck hunter named Ed Burt claimed to have found the Speedy. He claimed the wreckage he found matched the time period. And not to mention, he also found a cannon. And the Speedy was the only cannon-carrying ship that was lost in the area. And the exposed part of the ship's bell had the letter S on it. And so he got in touch with the government to get permission to haul it up and get it on display. But he was met with bureaucratic red tape, wherein he had to personally find and get government approval for a site to exhibit the wreck. And this took some time, but eventually he did find one, and it's not really clear if he was just stuck waiting for approval or if they just kept saying no. But either way, he would wait over 20 years before unfortunately passing away. He never told anyone the exact location of the wreckage, but apparently he did give a tip to a recreational diver named Jim Van Loosen as to its whereabouts. And so Van Loosen has been on the hunt ever since, but still nothing yet. Maybe it did really vanish due to something supernatural. Okay, that was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me through that one. So far, we've seen 3 incidents on the water, but boats aren't the only things that have disappeared around Lake Ontario. Pilot Craig Carlisle has just taken off from the Oshawa airport and is making his way to Buffalo, New York. The first half of his solo trip is going well, and he's about to reach the halfway mark over Lake Ontario. At this point, Toronto Air Traffic Control performed a handoff to Buffalo Air Traffic Control so that they could handle the rest of the flight. But the Buffalo Control was confused. They contact Toronto Air Traffic Control and tell them that they don't see the flight that they're talking about. Toronto then realizes that they don't see it either. The flight had simply just vanished off of their screens. A search would be launched, and according to Cochrane, there was no debris or any sign of the flight. Not only that, but at no point during its journey did the pilot mention any issues. No mayday or anything like that. Now, it's a bit difficult to find records of this flight, but some community-driven archival sites do seem to have this flight listed. And the reports on there say that some debris was spotted on the lake, but they didn't bother to try and identify it. And ultimately, this cause was ruled miscellaneous, undetermined. There are many cases fitting this description that have occurred over the years, without really any explanation as to what could have caused it. But it's possible we can find the solution by taking a look at some other aviation incidents in the area. In 1977, pilot Tom Walker took off from Toronto Island Airport, heading to his farm in Chesley. The weather was a bit foggy, but a veteran pilot like Walker was used to flying in these kinds of conditions. He was able to skillfully avoid it and fly underneath the fog when suddenly he hit a fog bank. And knowing he needed to get out of that, he began initiating a 180-degree turn, when suddenly the plane took a nosedive. And try as he might, he wasn't able to pull out of it. The plane started spiraling, and eventually he hit the ground. Somehow, he survived the crash. Despite the burns and multiple fractures, including a broken foot, He was able to walk to the nearest highway and flag down a motorist who drove him to the hospital, where he recovered. When asked about the cause, Walker just kind of blamed himself, though not really for any specific action, only saying that he wasn't fully used to the plane, so it felt a little awkward to fly. But he'd been flying for 8 years and thousands of hours, and during those years he often changed to different aircraft, and the plane he was flying he had just swapped to a few weeks prior to the incident. He doesn't remember much about the crash, but he simply stated that, "I still hadn't quite learned the feel of the plane, and it is difficult to convert from one plane to another." While there's definitely something to be said for being used to the plane, it's kind of surprising that someone with his experience would be able to fail so catastrophically. And it gets weirder when you put other similar incidents into context. In 1975, pilot Ron Scott was flying over Prince Edward County. The weather was perfect for flying and all was going well, when suddenly his plane banked sharply to one side and seemed to be stuck in this position. "It was as if an invisible giant took hold of the wing," says Scott. "I could not straighten it out. Luckily, the plane began to ease up and he was finally able to right the plane. But then again, it suddenly banked to the opposite side now. Scott was fighting to prevent the plane to enter a spin, and luckily for him, he was eventually able to do so. But he was never really able to shake off the feeling that some other force was in control that day. It was just totally weird," says Scott. "I've experienced nothing like that ever before or since, and I've never heard of anything like that. There are strange things out there." Additionally, Hugh Cochrane points to a well-known air disaster some call the Convent crash. On May 15th, 1956, a CF-100 interceptor was just finishing a training exercise, and currently flying at 33,000 feet, they notified their base that they were going to burn off some excess fuel before returning. Only a few moments later, without warning, the plane would crash straight into a convent known as the Villa St. Louis, killing 11 nuns, a civil servant, and the chaplain, who he himself was a retired naval padre. No official cause was ever determined, with most believing it was likely an oxygen failure that led to the crash. Hugh Cochrane lists many and more instances where pilots simply lost control of their craft and plunged to their deaths, or planes that are fine one moment and just disappeared without a trace the next. There are even multiple instances where a single wing of a plane would shear off, but wreckage investigation would rule out mechanical or engineering failure. It was as if it simply hit an invisible wall. So what is up with this area? Why is there such a high density of incidents? While some of them seem to be explainable, the concentration in the area is really unnerving. And that's not to mention the incidents that seem to defy conventional explanation anyway. It's just extremely weird. But it gets weirder. Over the years, Lake Ontario and its surrounding area has been home to a serious amount of UFO sightings. The sightings come in several varieties. Hugh Cochrane mentions records of instances where people saw lights maneuvering through the skies in ways that are impossible for known aircraft. Some people stated they've seen physical craft ranging in various shapes, discs, orbs, and cigars. Several instances of these sightings occur on the lake itself, with witnesses stating that the craft were hovering above the water, and some saying they've seen the craft diving into or out of the lake. There are so many, in fact, that talking about them alone would take up a whole video, so I've chosen not to dive into these stories for this video simply for the sake of time. But let me know if that's something that you'd be interested in seeing by dropping a message in the comments below. Okay, now let's get into the theories that Hugh Cochrane puts forth in his book. It's worth prefacing that Cochrane doesn't put any one theory over another. And he doesn't quite say it's as a matter of fact. It's more along the lines of, well, conventional science isn't giving us any satisfactory answers, so here are some alternatives. Central to these supernatural theories are the belief that all of these physical anomalies, disappearing objects, people, sudden weather phenomenon, compass failures, are all a result of unseen forces or energies that are affecting physical reality. He cites a couple of fringe researchers who call these kinds of areas reduced binding zones, which they theorize as regions that exhibit weakened gravitational and atomic forces, which can have an effect on the material world and even consciousness. This essentially lays the groundwork for the possibility that something within one of these zones could slip into another dimension. Expanding on this point, he also speaks on First Nations traditions. These traditions often mention portals to the spirit world, which a shaman could open and interact with these spirits. He also mentions some of these traditions discussing cities of light and sky people, Cochrane puts forth the idea that these are not mere legends or stories, but rather coded memories of interactions with an advanced race of either extraterrestrial or human origin. And then on the topic of advanced civilizations, he kind of likens this advanced race to that of fabled Atlantis. On that note, he also brings up the ideas of famous clairvoyant Edward Casey. Casey believed that Atlantis had these large crystal power sources and that they are still around under the sea, occasionally discharging energy. And it's this energy which causes disruptions in ships and aircraft. Cochrane is a bit skeptical of the survival of these crystals, but he uses it to add to the illustration of this kind of cross-cultural idea of ancient power centers that are submerged beneath the water. And this idea is also interesting if you consider the various accounts of UFO sightings around the area. Some of these eyewitness accounts place UFOs in the areas like power lines and other various energy sources. And if you remember, some also had seen them hovering above the water or diving into and out of it. And so if UFOs are attracted to power sources, then maybe wherever they are diving is actually home to one of these ancient underwater power centers. I've only really scratched the surface on his theories, as frankly, it's a lot to digest, and I'm not really confident enough to say I understand it all, even after having read it multiple times. That being said, though, Cochrane doesn't explicitly endorse any idea as being the truth. He's just kind of presenting these as sort of an invitation for the reader to begin thinking outside the box and explore more fringe ideas, as this may be the only way that the gates of Oblivion may start to make sense. Overall, it's a very interesting book. Previously, I'd never known any of these ship or aircraft incidents, and even I have to admit, while I'd expect the occasional operational disaster for a small area to have so many of them, and a good amount of them being square in that realm of we'll never know what actually happened, it really surprised me, and I'm glad that I read it. From my time investigating, there are a mix of genuine mysteries and also very real likely possibilities. But I can't help but now view this area with a sense of uncertainty. I'd love to visit, but maybe not for too long. For locals living in the areas around the vortex, it sort of entered their common vocabulary. I read an interview where someone mentioned that when people lose their keys or wallets or something like that, they just kind of joke that it must have slipped into the vortex. I feel like if it's so common that you can joke about it, there's probably just so many more mysteries in the area that have gone untold. Anyways, that about wraps it up for this video. If you found this video interesting, I would definitely recommend giving the book a read. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you know about the Marysburgh Vortex? Do you think this is a place of genuine mystery, or is all of this just like realistically explainable? We just unfortunately didn't have any witnesses, to attest the truth. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.